first off, welcome. My name's Kevin, and I'm proud to be a part of this wonderful organization. The Alexander Hamilton Society is one of over 50 nationwide chapters of students interested in the idea of American leadership. Through national security-focused events such as this one right here, we have constructive debates and conversations, hopefully learn something, and strive to improve our political discourse along the way. So all the way on your left here is Professor Audrey Cronin. She's our moderator for the evening. She's a professor of international security and the director for our newly formed Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology in our School of International Service. Just to highlight a little bit of her impressive resume, she's been a faculty member at George Mason, the National War College, Oxford, and before her academic career, she was specialist in terrorism at the Congressional Research Service, where she advised members of Congress in the aftermath of 9/11 and has executive branch experience in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, the Office of the Secretary of the Navy, and the American Embassy in Moscow. I encourage you all to look into pre-ordering her latest book, Power to the People: How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists. That comes out in October and is very related to the topic that we have here this evening. But I'll let her introduce our other distinguished guests, so without further ado, please welcome Professor Cronin and the rest of our guests.
That's a very kind introduction, Kevin. Thank you. And that throws the ball to me to introduce our two panelists. And I'll begin with the gentleman on my left, who is Elbridge Colby. He's director of the defense program at the Center for New American Security, where he leads CNAS's work on defense issues. Previously, Colby served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 18. And in that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent strategic planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. So anything about U.S. strategy and defense, this is the expert. Prior to entering his government service, Colby was, between 2014 and 2017, the Robert Gates Senior Fellow at CNAS, where he focused on a range of defense issues and consulted regularly with the Department of Defense and other U.S. government elements. From 2010 to 2013, he was at the Center for Naval Analyses. He's very widely published and also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a number of other very important organizations in town. To his left is Professor Joshua Rovner. He's one of ours. He's right here at AU. He's associate professor at the School of International Service, and he's a political scientist specializing in intelligence, strategy, and U.S. foreign policy. This year, Professor Rovner is scholar in residence at the National Security Agency. He's very widely published and has just recently come out with an edited book called Chaos in the Liberal Order: The Trump Presidency and International Politics in the 21st Century. His first book was a prize-winning book called Fixing the Facts: National Security and the Politics of Intelligence. It was a path-breaking study on the politicization of intelligence estimates. Before he came to us here at AU, he was the John Goodwin Tower Distinguished Chair in International Politics and National Security at Southern Methodist University, and was an associate professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College before that. So let's welcome our two panelists. So I have the lucky job as moderator to ask these two gentlemen some questions and to tease out a conversation that I hope will be interesting to all of us. So let's begin with Elbridge Colby. What do you think is the most important threat to the United States?
China.
Okay. Would you care to expand on that?
Sure. I tend to look at the world, and I'm working on a book on this now, so I'm thinking it through. But I tend to look at the world fundamentally through, a sort of, I guess you could say, moderate realist lens. So I'm, primarily look at the power balance, and consider that states' intentions can change and so forth, but that fundamentally the primary interest of the United States is in a world order in which we can, our Republican values, our prosperity, etc., can flourish. We can be secure. I don't think this requires, a full-fledged kind of liberal world order in the way that people often talk about it today. I think there's a lot of loose talk about that that's not connected to kind of clear strategic interests. But Napoleon said, "When China rises, it will shake the world," and China is rising and will continue to rise. And it is the first time in our history that we will have a potential rival whose total national power is comparable to our own, if not greater. And I look at what's the way that a power could unfavorably agglomerate strength and power, and that's by dominating one of the key regions of the world. Global power tends to be concentrated. It wouldn't necessarily have to be like that. You could have a world in which it was kind of randomly distributed, but it tends to be concentrated in Europe, North America, and a wider and wider part of Asia as that part of the world becomes the center of global economic activity again after a long hiatus. And China's the one power that could actually dominate that area. So while China's political leadership is certainly regards us as hostile and generally vice versa, they're not nearly as malevolent as ISIL, but they are infinitely more powerful. And so it's the combination of power and the potential for a hostile intent that makes me think that they're the most serious threat.
Okay, just to follow up with one quick follow-up question. China also has a tremendous amount of investment in the United States, which makes it very different from an ISIL. Is there no side of this where their interests are involved if there's conflict between us?
Sure. Well, I think, human history is replete with examples where people or states that have interconnection nonetheless fight. I think what that tells us, the fact that we have mutual interests and mutual interconnection, which may attenuate to some degree as the rivalry intensifies, but is that there is going to be a strong incentive for the limitation of the severity of the conflict. So I think in the 20th century, the wars that afflicted human society tended to go towards the totalistic. I think the existence of nuclear weapons makes that possibility ever present. And of course, any war, even if it didn't go nuclear, that involved two large powers like the United States and China, there would be the possibility for a World War I kind of style disaster. But of course, before World War I, there was the Franco-Prussian War, and there were the Cabinet Wars, and there were the Napoleonic Wars. There was the Mexican War on our part. So what I'm concerned about from a military perspective, as well as from an economic perspective, is that the Chinese would use their military and economic power and so forth to attempt to establish regional hegemony. And since we're mutually interconnected, both sides would have reasons to make sure that a war remained limited, or try to, and that the Chinese might try to arrange things in a way that they could probably risk war or threaten war in a way that we wouldn't have a sort of a reasonable basis for responding. And we can go into the scenarios in the particular situation, but I don't think economic interconnectedness, it's trite, but Britain and Germany, I think, were each other's biggest trading partners in 1914, so it's not an inherent block on things.
Okay, so let's see what Josh thinks. Do you agree with this as being the preeminent threat, or do you want to mention a different threat? Do you want to expand upon what Bridget just said?
Sure, I will expand on it a bit. I should say that I am currently on loan at NSA, but I'm obligated to say that these are all my views and I represent NSA or U.S. Cyber Command or any other government agency. I agree entirely with Bridge that in terms of foreign issues, I would look at China first and foremost, right? And essentially for the same reasons that Bridge laid out. Right? Not only is China becoming more powerful militarily, but we know that great power conflicts, while rare, are enormously consequential. Right? There's just nothing like a great power war in terms of its sheer destructiveness and the horror that's involved and what it does to international politics after the fact. So even though a great power conflict with China is of low likelihood, the consequences are really enormous. The China issue is worrisome for a couple of reasons from my perspective. One is that had we had this meeting in 1999, not 2019, I would have been really calm. And I would have been quite sanguine about it. Because China's military was not what it is today. Right? Its military was very sluggish. It was sort of overinflated. It was a jobs program for a lot of people. It couldn't project power in any meaningful sense. And I've had to admit over the years, it's come a long way. Right? The Chinese military today is not what it was 20 years ago. And this is a sign that a rising great power now has the economic wherewithal to invest in a military with, no kidding, lethal capabilities. Right? And my reading of history is that when great powers become economically strong, when they build strong militaries, they tend to throw their elbows around with unpredictable consequences. Right? I don't think that means that a conflict is likely. Right? Quite the opposite. I think it's fairly unlikely. But it's something to watch carefully about because the consequences of mismanaging this relationship are so enormous. So that's one element of why I would pay close attention to China. The other one has to do with Chinese domestic politics, right? Where China's a very odd rising great power. On the one hand, it's getting stronger and more ambitious in the region. On the other hand, it's a single-party state with a somewhat paranoid leadership, right, which worries, for good reason, about internal protests and internal threats to its own legitimacy. Right? So what are you left with? You're left with a great power which is strong and ambitious, but also sort of nervous. And that strikes me as a dangerous recipe. Right? Again, does this mean that we're all looking at calamity? Not at all. But it is enough that we should be looking at it carefully.
I sense a somewhat different take from the two of you. There's a bit of nuance, perhaps. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. But it sounds to me like Josh is less concerned about the imminent possibility of a great power war. Is that true? Are you seeing that as something that is imminent, Elbridge?
No, but I think it's plausible. And when you say great power war, I'd interpret that as a the most plausible would be a very serious but limited war in the Western Pacific that could spiral out of control. But the Chinese being a rising power, their general incentive is to wait and just get more powerful. Our incentive is to cobble together a coalition of states that fear China dominating the region. So that's going to be the dynamic, and then the question will be the assessments on the two sides of what pays off. I think nuclear weapons, and there's obviously the cultural element to it, kind of the commercialization of human society, etc. A number of factors probably make countries like the United States and China less prone towards major war. I mean, the United States has probably become more belligerent as a society in the last century, but not about major wars with major adversaries, but kind of more secondary conflicts and interventions than it was, say, in the kind of isolationist period. But I think what's more likely to happen, I'm always kind of reluctant to say whether something's likely or not, and I know Josh knows this, but it's a little bit like a depression. I mean, for 70 years after the Great Depression, people would say a financial crisis is really unlikely, but that, of course, induces the kind of behavior that makes that very scenario more likely, as he knows very well, so I'm not suggesting he doesn't. But I think what we're likely to see is more risk-taking behavior and attempts at coercion and brinksmanship, and that will heighten the possibility of conflict. So one of the things we were trying to do, I've certainly been trying to do, is to signal very clearly that the United States has an enduring interest in Asia, and your husband, Patrick Cronin, has been a real leader in this field for many years in this vein. So a firm stance now is more likely to make war less likely, because the Chinese won't misinterpret our resolve. I think the main danger, and that Josh may disagree with me here, I'm curious, the main danger is that the Chinese underestimate us and underestimate the coalition that we can assemble and push too hard, and then a war becomes more likely.
Josh?
Yeah, predicting the outbreak of war is a fool's errand. There's an apocryphal story of a British intelligence analyst. I don't think this really happened, but it's a great story, so I'll tell it. So in 1950, he's an old British intelligence guy, and he's retiring, and somebody asks him to review his track record. It's like, how do you think you did? I said, well, look, I've been in intelligence for the last half century, and every year I predicted there would be no great power war, and I was only wrong twice. So this is inherently hard to predict. Like, war is a complex thing. How it starts is complicated. So what concerns me is the general recipe, like the general conditions that would lead countries to come into a crisis and then escalate into war. Right? Some of those conditions, but not all of them, are present in East Asia. Right? You have the United States, which very much likes the regional status quo. Right? It views it as a great success story since 1945, rebuilding East Asia, making it a prosperous place, right, and central to the global economy. And on the other hand, you have a rising great power, China, which, from its perspective, doesn't have enough influence in its own region. Right? And China, looking out over the ocean, sees a ring of U.S. bases and U.S. allies and partners, and probably doesn't like that. Right? So wants to push out, is pushing out in ways that we can watch. The United States is saying no. Right? Just yesterday, the United States, it created a red line. It says we will defend on behalf of the Philippines in case of a conflict. Right? So that's not nothing. So you do have two very powerful countries with differing interests in the region. But again, like, why do I think this is relatively unlikely? Well, it's not just that there are deep interconnections between the economies. There's reasons for both sides not to do it for economic reasons. But there's also the opportunity cost in other ways. The political value of going to war is probably less than the political value of staying at peace, because both countries have a lot of other things that they would like to do, and I think they know that war would be a disaster. Right? So that's why I'm somewhat optimistic about this, but again, worth watching closely.
Okay, one last question on China before I hope that we'll turn to Russia for a minute. What about China's strong interest in artificial intelligence? Where do you think that fits in China's strategy with respect to its approach to the United States? In other words, let's look at it from the Chinese perspective and look at what they're doing, particularly in AI. Anything you want to say, Rich?
Sure. I mean, I think they're, and you can, they have the main China stuff and the Great Rejuvenation. I mean, I think they're, making state-based, very, very broad and significant state-based level investments in the kind of commanding heights of the economy, or what they perceive, and you know more about this than I do. And AI, I think, is in some sense probably the central area, given what I understand. And that's for broad societal reasons and dominating the kind of the most sophisticated elements of economic activity. And also for military applications. I mean, AI is going to be incredibly important in a kind of battle of networks, which is what modern warfare would be. So I think that's I think AI is going to be very important, and I expect them to continue.
Yeah, I mean, China has many reasons for being really interested in AI. Economic reasons, it's central to so many industries going forward. It's a prestige issue. China clearly seems to believe it's a prestige issue. It keeps saying so, right? That we want to be the world leader in this. And there's military applications, right? The military aspect is particularly interesting. Despite China's rise over the last 20 years, it's still in a position of relative military poverty compared to the United States today. Right? The United States has some pretty important structural advantages, right? Not the least of which is the geography of maritime East Asia and the U.S. advantage in the undersea competition, right, with submarines. That's not nothing. I mean, there's Chinese military power becomes less and less the further it goes from its coastline, right? And so this is a problem. And China, in some respects, has been dealing with this relative conventional military imbalance for a long time. It might be where Chinese leaders see disruptive technologies, see things like AI as a way of leveling the playing field, right? That if we can make technological breakthroughs in cyber, in AI, in quantum computing, perhaps we can overcome the U.S. material advantages in the region. So again, there's a reason. Now I'll give you one more thing to think about. very often great powers, when faced with new technologies, have, let's say, exaggerated beliefs about what that technology can provide in a conflict scenario. Okay? And both the United States and China talk about the importance of information in warfare and in controlling what they call the information space. It might be where, in practice, war turns out to be really messy, and their hopes for what they can accomplish with these technologies don't work out so well, which would leave them with a big problem. If their plans don't work, if the technologies fizzle in the moment, what do they do? That could be a really nasty scenario to think about.
Okay, well, on the nasty scenario topic, I'm going to start with you this time, Josh, just to mix things up. Russia. What if I made the argument, or wanted you to respond to the argument, that focusing upon the kind of horse race comparison between great powers has apparently caused us to lose attention to one of the greatest threats to our democracy, which is apparently Russian interference of some kind in our election? There could be nothing more central to a democracy than the integrity of elections. Isn't that one of the things that makes Russia a considerable threat to the United States?
This is a great question, and it's central to a lot of the thinking that's going on right now at NSA and U.S. Cyber Command. This is not secret. They've been very public about this. There's been a lot of talk about the midterm elections and the work that was done by those agencies to try to stave off foreign influence and make sure that election was legitimate and secure, and it turns out it was. I'll answer the question in a sort of roundabout way. One thing that worries me greatly is the long-term decline in Americans' faith in their own institutions. And this is not a new trend. This goes back to the 1960s and up to the present. So you can see it. Like Gallup does a great job of tracking these things for us. Like, do you trust your government? Do you believe in your institutions? And the numbers are going down, right, at a worrying rate. Right? Okay, so the situation is 2016, and we have near a half century of decline in Americans' faith in their own elections. You have a very peculiar campaign in which people are talking about American politics being rigged and unfair and unjust somehow. You have a new technology in social media which is allowing a lot of these ideas to spread very rapidly to a lot of people. Right? And on top of that, then you have a foreign actor who is stirring the pot, right? Who is injecting a lot of noise into this already very noisy ecosystem. Right? That was troubling, to say the least. That was troubling. Now, what makes it particularly troubling wasn't so much that Russia was making mischief on Facebook. Right? Russia and the Soviet Union before it has a lot of experience. It's been doing this sort of stuff forever. The difference is that in the past, they failed again and again and again. In the Cold War, Soviet efforts at what they called active measures in the United States were hilarious failures. Right? They just couldn't reach a lot of people. They couldn't sway a lot of opinion. It was sort of a catalog of disaster from their point of view. This time might have been different. And again, it was that combination of declining faith in institutions, plus new technology, plus a historically weird campaign season, right, which was this perfect storm. Now, it might be, if you're an optimist, that it was just a weird confluence of events, that everything came together and it was very strange, and 2016 is not likely to be replicated. Like 2018, what we just experienced, normal election, it's fine, right? We'll get back to normal. If you're a pessimist, you say, wow, trends in American domestic politics are unhealthy. There's a lot of rancor, there's a lot of partisanship, there's a lot of sort of weirdness on the internet. How are we going to restore sort of a basic level of faith in institutions? That's a long-term project. It's not going to be easy.
I think I have a somewhat different view. I mean, I would say, so I guess to your original question, Audrey, I would definitely put Russia considerably behind China as a secondary threat to the United States and our interests abroad. My basic sense is Russia poses a significant threat to Eastern NATO and in its military capability there, and which is something that we should really work to address, consistent with arms control measures and other things to try to mitigate the risks of escalation and so forth. I think the Russians' effort to interfere in our election are obviously opprobrious and something that we rightly condemned, and we should try to block. I guess my sense is that I'm pretty laissez-faire, in the sense that if Americans want to have a weird and disruptive election, as probably most people in the OECD appear to want to do, that's kind of what democracy is about. So I guess I have sort of a more narrow view. We should make sure that our election machines work and our election systems accurately tabulate. But I got to tell you, and it reflects some conversations, and I don't want to put cybercrime, I don't want you to put you on the spot, these to be cybercrime and NSA, but there's some things I hear out of the military and the intelligence services that look a little bit like they're judging what's appropriate for Americans to. I think there needs to be a very, very, very fine line. I mean, I was going back and forth on the foreign influence stuff. We are against illicit foreign influence, but there are obviously some kinds of foreign influence that are totally fine. If Gideon Rackman or Timothy Garton-Ash wants to write an op-ed in the whatever, we don't have a problem with that, right? So we need to have a clear sense of my general sense, it's a little bit like my views on campaign finance reform, it's not what we're talking about, but I tend to have a more, basically our system, we trust the American people to sort out what's reasonable and what's not. And it's not the place of, certainly not appointed officials, or let alone military officials at the very least, to determine what's appropriate. And I'm not putting these words in your mouth, but I found there's this narrative about, and I think the American people were saying pretty clearly in 2016 on both sides that they were sick of the way things were going, and we got to deal with that. Again, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I just, there's blocking the Russians from screwing with our elections and undermining them in particular. But we don't want to throw the baby of vigorous free expression and debate out with the bathwater. Okay.
All right, let's let Josh have his own words from his own mouth.
It feels like you're putting words in my mouth.
Okay.
I don't disagree with any of that.
But
obviously,
tell me where, because not that I'm putting words in your mouth, but I feel like this is. Well, hold on, no, but I feel like this is an issue that there's a lot of discussion about this, and I haven't heard my point of view that frequently.
Josh.
So there's a range of, hypothetically speaking, there's a range of things that a hostile foreign adversary could do to influence domestic politics. Some of that is perfectly legitimate, right? If foreign states want to get in the propaganda business, who are we to stop them, right? It's not anybody's business to prevent American people from hearing ideas from foreign countries, right? But there's a lot of other things they can do, right? Besides the simple things like hacking voter rolls or hacking actual machines, right? Obviously, that's a bridge too far. You can think of other things like hacking candidates, right? And here's something to think about. There's going to be a lot of candidates in the 2020 election. I think approximately 700 have already declared, right? So not all of these campaigns are going to have big staffs. Not all of them are going to have big money, right? Not all of them are going to be prepared to deal with their own cyber hygiene, right? And in a very intense and chaotic thing called an even-numbered year, when they've got a zillion other things to worry about. One thing that I would watch out for is if an adversary tries to get into those campaign networks, stealing their information, releasing it to the public, that again would be a problem, right? So I totally agree.
Yeah.
There's a range of foreign activities, some of which we cannot and should not try to stop, right? And some that we can and should. So that's all I'm saying.
But that's the rub, isn't it? Exactly deciding which ones. I mean, we're not talking about specific things like deep fakes
Indeed.
that can be easily used in order to
Indeed.
turn a campaign. I mean, it's very simple to apply leverage in a particular place. and to have an impact that does not allow the American people to express its desire.
One thing that's heartening to me on this issue is that this is one area where, at least recently, there seems to be genuine bipartisan agreement that this is a hard issue and that we have to tackle it together. Right, if you watched Senate Armed Services Committee a couple of weeks ago had testimony with General Maxoni, the NSA director, and it was a really thorough discussion. It wasn't, you didn't see a lot of theatrics from the committee, you didn't see a lot of no partisanship at all, but there was also a recognition that this is really tricky, right? And these issues, both legal and philosophical, are part of what it takes to safeguard an election, right? That you can't go too far, but at the same time you have to try to figure out where those reasonable safeguards lie. And the real good news, to get back to your original point, is that this ultimately isn't going to be decided by anybody in the military. This is a policy decision. This is a legislative issue, right? This is not something that General Maxoni or anybody else in uniform gets to decide.
Well, I think, if I could, Audrey, I think that what Josh describes makes a lot of sense. I was talking about it with a very thoughtful lawyer who's now about this and what the right line is. And I think things like you're talking about, and you mentioned like fraud, breaking into people's, those things should probably be illegal if they're not already. Where I guess my tendency would be to kind of let things sort themselves out would be in the promotion of ideas and the discussion and debate, and then especially in a world in which information flows across borders without any hindrance. One of the problems is, well, it's okay for us to do propaganda outside. We don't want to propagandize our own people, but U.S. propaganda outwards easily comes right back. So and that's where I think, really, in a sense, like, you've written a lot about this in intelligence. It's like we should kind of stick to like our true talking points and just stick to them, whether we're talking here or abroad, because there's no difference anymore. So like even as like a council of prudence, we should kind of like not be in the deception business, and then just let the power of ideals stand, and people on right and left and center and various other parts of the spectrum will fund other people to get the Russian lies and fakes, hopefully, out of the system. But maybe I'm too sanguine, maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's kind of, I guess it reflects my...
I think I think long term, the quality and health of the American public debate is going to be decided in the United States. Right? I do think this is sort of a generational issue. I'm really heartened to see all these folks out here on a cold night to talk about this stuff. I'm a big advocate of more investment in public school education in government, like old-fashioned civics courses. Right? And again, I think this is an issue where the right and the left can come together and make common ground. My happy place 50 years from now, well, is that I'm alive, but also that there is widespread understanding of American government, respect for institutions, the idea that we can actually have debate about appropriate policies. And when we get to that place, right, when my kids and my grandkids are in that place, then I won't have to worry about any foreign mischief. Right? We can return to a situation as it was in the Cold War when the Soviet efforts were glorious failures.
Okay, I think we have time to take some questions now, if there are questions from the audience. I believe that what you need to do is come down the aisle and stand before this microphone.
I helped run this thing. Is there anyone else who wants to go before me?
Well, you've committed now.
Yes. Obviously, the prerequisite thank yous for coming out, so it's appreciated. Can you hear?
It sounds like there's feedback. Would that be from
Is it the phone?
your phone, perhaps?
Mine? Oh no, definitely not. It's on airplane mode. I'll just give it a go. All right, so I'm wondering if you guys can give a threat assessment on Russian financial crimes, and in particular, how to combat a state in which corruption is a structural and institutional fact.
Did you hear that in the back?
Yeah, we got it.
Good. Okay. Who wants to tackle that? Corruption in Russia. Institutionally.
It's a great question. I mean, one question is whether or not it's our responsibility to combat Russian corruption. Right? I think that's probably beyond our resources to do. Right? If you're talking about just purely Russian domestic corruption, there are limits to American power and our responsibilities. In another sense, though, the fact that this is a problem, a deeply seated problem in the Russian economy, I think limits the danger of Russian expansion. Right? Russia is, I'll probably part ways with Bridge a little bit. Russia has some real bad internal problems, like seriously bad, like population declining, corruption rampant, and what remains a commodities exporting economy. You don't see a lot of great powers that thrive as commodities exporters, right? Especially not ones that are deeply corrupt. So my general sense is that this is not our problem to solve. It's Russia's problem to solve. And it's going to be a hindrance long term on its ability to export itself and to project power.
So if I may-
Actually, well, let me just comment on that. I actually basically totally agree with you. Sorry. And I think to bring all of the things together that we've been talking about so far, if you're worried about election interference, as we all should be, what the Chinese will be able to do with the vastly greater resources makes the Russians pale in insignificance. Dealing with the Russians is primarily about what we can, the lengths, the protections that we want to institute and how they're compatible with our political ideas, and we may have variations on the theme. But the Chinese will have so much greater leverage to influence things.
I would slightly disagree, not that I'm not a member of the panel, but I have a microphone, so I would only say that I do believe that Russia is a serious threat in terms of its transnational criminal networks, and it goes well beyond the borders.
Yeah, and so mind if I follow up?
I think you better let someone else, since you're an organizer too, so.
Use my own argument against me, I like it.
All right. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you so much for having this panel, by the way, Daniel. And I just wanted to ask, with the new elections, with the new elections,
Don't worry.
with the new elections, an indictment of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm wondering if, with the new military, Naftali Bennett now is may take the elections, how, from your different perspectives, will again make a threat assessment on how that elections with the indictment, which is coming up really soon, and how that can affect our relations, at least in the Middle East, with Iran and other powers.
I don't have any specific answer to how the indictments are going to affect U.S.-Israeli relations or Middle Eastern relations. I mean, I think that the long-term trend in U.S.-Israeli politics is deeper than any given leader, right? And is deeper than any given issue. Whatever you think about that relationship, it's proven to be enduring, and I think it's going to go on. So I don't see any sort of immediate change.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I was talking about this earlier. The Israeli, I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but my impression is the Israeli public seems pretty content with the security situation. I don't think there are big issues in the U.S.-Israel relationship right now. I think Josh is right that it's largely, goes beyond individual administrations.
Thank you, Dan. Please.
Hi, good evening. Could everyone hear me? All right. My name is Victor. Thank you for joining us tonight. So I have a two-part question. First question is, what are your thoughts on the weaponization of artificial intelligence? I know we briefly touched about it earlier today, and artificial intelligence is kind of a new concept, new idea, being new techniques, tactics, procedures that we may pursue. What are your thoughts on it?
Was that the, sorry, was
No,
that
you
That's
have
the
to ask
first-
them both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you
The
only
second
get
part
one.
question is, what can we expect of the adversary's implication and use of artificial intelligence for their technology and capabilities?
AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think AI is invariably going to be weaponized. I mean, as any technology has to be, and if we're not in the game, then the Chinese will establish a major and potentially commanding lead. I mean, Josh is absolutely right that you never know how technology is going to work, but if you don't make a good effort at it, you're definitely going to be in a worse position. We should, I think, as the Department of Defense has stated, we should use it in an ethical fashion consistent with our principles and so forth. But I think it's going to be, there's a chance it could be decisive because I mean, so much of what the application of military force is now, I mean, not speaking from personal experience, but my impression from people who have is that it's about the more rapid, precise, decisive application of violent force. And AI, in a contest of sophisticated battle networks, basically both sides are going to try to make each other dumber. AI is going to make you smarter. It's not going to take over the highest functions in a near sort of plausible future. But in terms of recognition and all these kinds of things, and more effective decision, more efficient decision, it's going to be extremely important. So it's really a super important area.
Yeah, I mean, AI is a big sweeping term for a lot of different technologies. But in general, what AI does is it lets you take huge amounts of information and process it at like breakneck speeds, right? Which has applications in the military and the intelligence world and in finance and on Wall Street. There's a million things you can do with it. What's particularly interesting to me is that AI in theory can allow militaries to do remarkable things. It can allow them to coordinate vast numbers of forces over vast distances and deliver lethal fires at astonishing speed. The problem is that in war, you have two militaries that are trying to kill each other, right? And your ability to coordinate large numbers of forces over vast distances, even with AI, is going to be really, really hard to do when there's somebody trying to prevent you from doing it. So while I agree entirely, AI it's inevitable. It's something that we need to invest in and understand. How it actually plays out in a conflict scenario is still tricky.
Just so you know, Victor, Josh and I run a new center here at AU, which had an event a couple of weeks ago where we focused on artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And you might want to look it up online because there's information there about artificial intelligence, in particular, the whole question of killing machines.
Okay.
So,
Can we speak offline about that once?
sure. Well, the name of the center is the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm an AU alumni. My question shifts the focus of China from the Pacific region and more towards the West, particularly the former Soviet Union, with the Belt and Road Initiative. We see China spending upwards of $900 billion on building infrastructure, ports, small businesses, large businesses, in countries that are looking to join Western institutions, particularly Ukraine and Georgia. My question then is, what is the threat of Belt and Road to these countries and their ability to join these institutions? Is this a way of China using its new economic prosperity to weaken the West's ability to appeal to these countries?
In general, China has engaged in a lot of economic diplomacy over the last 20 years, right? Some people talk about it as being soft power, some people talk about it as sort of a way of using not just Belt and Road, but all kinds of FDI in order to win support in the region, and then moving towards the West to expand influence using financial instruments, investing greatly in it. Belt and Road it's really fascinating from a sort of geostrategic perspective. You can be incredibly pessimistic or actually a little optimistic about it. The pessimistic story, sort of akin to what you're telling, is look, China is very smart and savvy about how to increase its influence and as a result subtly undermine American influence, right? Using not military tools, but roads and infrastructure projects and local investment. And that's something that is over time going to shift the balance. The optimistic story, which I think is also worth thinking about, is that the more that China turns its attention into land expansion, right, the road part, the more likely it is that we can help mitigate some of the tensions in maritime East Asia. That is, if China saw its path to greatness only through naval expansion and ejecting American naval power from that region, oh boy, look out. But if China has a way of going inward, it could act as a kind of release valve, right? And it could see a different, maybe more peaceful path towards achieving its objectives.
Anything to say? I have two concerns that would perhaps be relevant. The first is that the Chinese have been very good at indebting the countries with whom they're building infrastructure, and so they're trapped into a kind of a debt relationship, and that's a source of power. The second is the facial recognition technology that the Chinese are transferring wholesale to many countries and encouraging their ability to engage in much more authoritarian governance.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Matt. Thank you so much for doing this tonight. My question relates to U.S. defense spending. Specifically, some have argued that the U.S. spends a lot of money on programs that will be increasingly vulnerable in the event of a conflict with China, namely aircraft carriers and manned aircraft. My question is, do you see this as a problem? And if so, how do we kind of urge defense spending in a direction less consistent with, like, kind of, I guess, programs with ardent defenders?
Well, I mean, this is a great question and a really important issue. I would say one of the things we were trying to do in the Pentagon under Secretary Mattis's leadership is start to change, really materially change, in all respects, the way the department thinks about how to prepare to fight. And really, what its job is to move away from what it's mostly been focused on for the last 25 years, counterterrorism and shaping operations and presence activities and these kinds of things, and focus again on being prepared to fight a war against a great power. And once there's that, and I think the implicit logic is once there's that conceptual recognition of the problem, it's like AA, if you realize you have a problem, then you'll deal with it. Then we'll start to see people actually engaging with what the force needs to look like and how that's different. I will say I don't have super strong views on individual programs because I'm not sufficiently technical often to have a really, really informed view. And there's a while I'm sympathetic to the dramatic sort of revolutionary types, there sometimes is a glibness about some of the trade-offs and some of the capability of legacy systems. I'm not defending all the legacy systems or by any stretch. One of the issues I think is how does the department responsibly get from here to there? So one of the lessons of like 15 years ago with Future Combat System that the Army decided was a real leap ahead kind of thing, and I think Josh is touching on some of these issues, and then it kind of like flops on its face. It's this sort of, we're going to figure out how to dance around, and do triple, spins in the air, and then it's going to all be incredible, and we're going to have total information dominance. Okay, maybe, but let's have a healthy dose of skepticism and figuring out. So one of the things I think that's most useful is really trying to get the department back and the nation focused on, all right, what is it that we want our military to do? So Dave Ochmanek at RAND, I think, has a good sort of, it's not perfect, but it's a good rule of thumb, which is we want our military to be able to sink, I think it's like 200-something Chinese ships in the first 72 hours in the Taiwan Strait, and we want to be able to destroy X hundred Russian armored vehicles in the Baltics in the first 72 hours of the conflict. If your program has a plausible way of doing that within the FIDIP, which is the 5-year plan for the Defense Department, okay, then it's going to stand a pretty good chance. Now, is it going to stand a chance in 10 years? Then we're going to want something else, and think about that. But it's not like, we don't think about it in a vacuum, like is a carrier or something. First of all, there are carriers in the force that are already paid for. We're not going to recoup that cost. So then the question becomes, well, how could you employ it? How could you think about it? What kind of air wing would you put on it? How would you couple it with associated, aircraft operating from land, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, then we have a different conversation. And if the Navy can't come up with a good explanation for how it's a cost-effective in high-end conflict, well, then we need to have a really serious conversation about the future of the carrier. But let's see what they actually can say. Let's see what they put on the carrier. Let's see what their plan is. So I tend to be kind of like, definitely a reformist, but a bit skeptical of the sort of, everything's going to be unmanned in 5 years or we're toast. And I think to Josh's point, we got to remember, I tend to be pretty sober and pretty negative, pretty unsanguine about the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. I tend to be quite concerned about them. But we also need to remember they have hard problems to solve too. I mean, if they want to take over Taiwan, they got to launch an amphibious invasion across almost 100 nautical miles of water that's going to be filled with all kinds of lethal projectiles if they try it. So we need to look at the right context and think about it in that vein.
Yeah, just real quick. I think that thinking about this question through the lens of strategy also helps. Like you approach it through the lens of budget issues, right? And constituencies that favor certain programs and not others. But think about it from a strategic perspective. To get to Bridget's last point, what kind of war are you going to fight, right? How are you going to use military force to achieve your political goals in the kind of conflict you are likely to face? Sometimes the answers to that are really mundane, like the kind of technologies that might end up being super consequential in a U.S.-China conflict have nothing to do with like AI and precision and all of the high-tech Hollywood stuff. There are things as simple as how fast can you fill craters on a runway, right? Or how easily can you go back to simple low-tech communications in the event that your high-tech communications go down, right? That's like the boring stuff, but it's incredibly important. So if I was speaking to these issues of what kind of force would you build for East Asia, I would try to keep people focused on that aspect of it, not just should we have F-22 or should we have this or that or the other.
Thank you.
I would just add that you need to remember the role of Congress. It's very common for legacy systems to be canceled by the Pentagon and put back in by Congress because there's a tremendous amount of domestic support for the economic benefits that they bring to local constituencies.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to take questions in groups of 2. We'll get through this line, but if you two could say your questions one after another, and then the last 2, we'll handle it that way, okay? Please.
So, my name is Maz. Thank you for coming out here today. Since it's predicted that by 2040, China's going to take over key aspects of U.S. national security, do you feel like there will be a balance of power or a balance of threat against the U.S.?
Okay, so hold on. And next question, please.
Hello, my name is Ethan. Thank you all again for coming out tonight to talk with all of us. I'm going to try and bring the conversation back home. Definitely, we were talking a lot about not only social media, but also personal information, 2 really crucial things that we have to discuss in the contemporary moment. Can social media, can these mechanisms of personal private information be used as a democratic, yes, that's the word, democratic tool? Can we effectively regulate that, or is that more so something that we should aim to kind of let the private sector dole out in its own accordance?
Okay. Which one do you want to handle first?
Well, I think to your first question, if I understand it correctly, I think we're in a competition with the Chinese, and now we're increasingly focused on it. So I don't think I would concede that they're going to become dominant in these sectors. I think maybe what you're getting at is that China is likely to be larger than the American economy over time because of the size of the Chinese population. So structurally, what we're going to see and what we need to try to leverage is the fact that other countries, which are also very large but smaller than China, like Japan and India in particular, are not going to want to be dominated by the Chinese. And so we're going to need to work with them and more closely. And it's not, you guys didn't, Josh and I sort of grew up in the world of unipolarity of the 1990s and the 2000s and whatever the Americans said went.
Good times.
Good times, no. We made a lot of bad decisions. But I think you guys have grown up in a more humbling era, which, and that's the future, but we're going to have to be more, in some ways more assertive, more strategic, and more, we're not going to be able to lecture and hector everybody, but we're going to have to stand up for our values. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to assemble favorable balances of power. And that's what my work is mostly about. I think to your question, as you can probably tell, I'm pretty skeptical about the government regulating social media. I don't trust the tech companies or want that. I don't, and I don't really trust them regulating either. I mean, you know, and I don't know what the answer is, but I guess at my core, I think that, or I guess what I think the core American idea is that we trust people to have their views, and as long as they're not kind of punching each other in the face or yelling, firing a crowded theater like this.
Have you been on Twitter lately?
Yeah, yes, and it's like insane, but I mean,
Or
like,
beheading people?
well, beheading people is, that should be, I'm pretty sure that's illegal, but I mean, I thought that was kind of what America was about, so, is about, and that's certainly my vision of America, and so I'm just, what Josh is saying is absolutely right. That is the outcome that we want, where Americans trust their institutions. But maybe the way to get to trust their institutions again is to not trust them for a while. I don't know. I have a lot of skepticism about my ability to understand what the right question is. But I'm pretty sure that I don't trust others as well. So.
Good to know. Josh?
I think, who do I trust?
Josh was expected to play that role. So.
No. I think that regulation with social media is already happening and it's inevitable. And not because there is a desire to control speech from on high, but because social media is increasingly intertwined with financial interactions and possession of personal information and things that I think actually should be regulated.
Well, yeah.
Right. So
Sure. Yeah. Depends on what you're saying, yeah.
when you have large companies who are increasingly central to how people live, not just how they debate online, they're going to be the focus of regulation.
Right. Sure. Yes.
Right? So it's not a matter of whether, it's how, and how far is too far. Can it be a force for good? I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Right? As with just about every technological innovation, and there are some that are just pure bad, but most are a double-edged sword. And in social media, in some ways, it's frightening. Again, going on Twitter lately, right? People say terrible things, like atrocious behavior online. And at the same time, I get to see pictures of my friends' kids. That's awesome. And I get to reconnect with somebody that I was in junior high with. That's fantastic.
That's awesome.
And well, 8th grade was okay. Right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, these are wonderful things, and I can talk with people all over the world and learn. I mean, it's fabulous, right? So, I know this is sort of a mealy-mouth answer, but it's a little bit of both.
Can I just say on the regulation thing? I totally agree with you about PII, personally identifiable. Obviously, there's going to be regulation. I'm talking more about the regulation of substantive speech that's not otherwise obviously covered. I guess, in some sense, I don't pine for the days when there was a establishment that controlled, big three networks, and Walter Cronkite told us those. I think it's it's good that people can say whatever they want. They got a platform, and the way to deal with people behaving like complete beeps, on Twitter, is to have our society mature so that there's appropriate social penalties for people who behave like that.
Which again is why I got to the idea of civic education.
Yeah.
I mean, this starts young. Right? Before little Johnny gets his first Twitter handle, tell him about
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And then the last two questions together, and rapidly, please, concisely.
So my question was, Professor, you'd mentioned the Chinese export of surveillance technology to authoritarian-leaning states, and you've seen other Chinese companies like Huawei emerge as sort of nefarious actors on the international stage. A few years ago, the U.S. Commerce Department slapped ZTE with a denial order, but President Trump reversed that. But do you think that the U.S. should be doing more to prevent the export of these surveillance technologies to not-so-friendly governments? And if so, what should we be doing about
The
it?
U.S., so you're not talking about China.
Well, Chinese technology, but some of it has U.S. origin content.
I see. Okay, thank you. Next question. We'll wrap it up with this one.
All right, so to
No.
okay.
You have to be loud.
All right. So quickly to follow up, with
You got the last word after all.
So in corporative associations consolidating power within the institutions of Russian government and the economy, creating kind of decentralized apparatus, and sometimes it pursues its own foreign policy, like Kyrgyzstan in 2004, great example, Ukraine 2014, etc. That latter one was a little bit more centrally directed, but you get the point. So how do you combat a foreign policy that is not entirely decentralized, but does act semi-independently from the loci of power, the locus of power?
Right, okay, so proxy armies, private armies, and so on.
And not so much, more like
Hybrid.
economic coercion, adventurism by Russian businesses, so on and so forth. It does
Transnational crime, corruption. Okay, so all the wonderful
The juicy
transnational
stuff.
issues.
Yeah, I mean, in one respect, having power decentralized makes life a lot more complex. Right? And Tom Christensen wrote a great book called "Worse Than a Monolith." Right? Sometimes having a divided enemy is really bad because you have nobody to negotiate with, because you have nobody to deal with diplomatically. And in cases like what I think you're getting at is that this becomes a really serious foreign policy challenge. Right? Now, it's not something you solve. That's the first principle. Not something you solve. It's something that at best you manage. The second principle, and I would defer to Bridge on this, is that it's a matter of policy priorities. If you really want to invest the U.S. government in trying to tackle all of these illicit networks, you are going to drain resources from other priorities, like the great powers, right? My tendency is to worry more about the great powers with the understanding that there's a real trade-off, and this is not easy to do. Now, when those transnational actors start to actually draw blood and create political instability, then it becomes a much harder thing. When it's purely about crime and money, it's bad, but it's not something that obviously implicates American national security. It's when they start, combining profit motive with violence, then you have to get away with that.
So, well, on that one, I mean, it's interesting because most of the time when you hear about people complain about the Russians, or not complain, but sort of talk about the Russian challenge by Russia, it's because they have unity. And what's called, in the military is called an OODA loop, it's like observe, orient, decide, act. Basically, their decision cycle is much tighter and quicker because, Putin is like highly centralized the system. So like in a NATO contingency that they could like act well before NATO could decide what to do. I think the other things, first of all, there's sort of the way to deal with it is either to penalize the behavior, like criminal activity, you just deal with this criminal activity. And if the Russians want to deny it, well then fine. And if they want to assume it up to the state, well then the other way to deal with it is to hold the state accountable for the actions of their, in Syria, and there's stuff was reported in the press, the United States has dealt with some Russian proxies in a way that, was pretty direct, and the Russians decided to say, well, we're going to wipe our hands of that. So I don't think that's it, but I think Josh's basic point is exactly right, which is we got to concentrate on the main event, which is the Chinese in particular. I'd say to your question, and this gets back to the Belt and Road, which I didn't comment on. I think I was actually in somewhere. Well, I was in another country making this point. Countries, including the United States, but much more elsewhere, are going to have to decide whether they will swallow the poison pill or whatever you want to call it of Chinese largesse. Do you want to have a Huawei 5G system? And there's been stories about what that entails in Africa and stuff like that for the surveillance state. Do you want to have these sweetheart deals that you get to, if the Chinese will build you a port and maybe there will be some military application and they pass some bribes? I think the way for us to deal with it, and I'm happy to be a sort of realpolitik type, but I actually think the most realpolitik way for us to deal with this is not to try to match them dollar for yuan, but is to say, look, yes, we have money. Yes, the Japanese and the Indians and the Europeans have money. But also, when we lend you money, it's going to be for commercial purposes, and it's for the long-term interest of your nation. We are not going to try. We have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and American businesses might occasionally yelp about it. Actually, now I don't think they do, because they're used to operating ethically and without bribes. And then we'll say to the people of Sri Lanka, like, this government sold you out to go, and they moved all their money to Monaco, and that's how the Chinese roll. Because they're going to get theirs at some point. This is not a gift, I can assure you. Because, by the way, the Chinese leadership is in some ways accountable to their people at home, not through democratic elections, but they, there's a limit to what they can do. And so that's the countries certainly of Asia, but even more Latin America, places like this, Europe, look at some of the decisions on Huawei. They're, people are getting a sense. So there's naturally balancing behavior. So what we have to do is, in a forceful but reasonable way, show that we are the lead in checking China's ambitions for regional dominance and beyond, and help other countries that want to preserve their own independence. And I think that's the right recipe for our future strategy.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there, and let's thank our panelists.